All right, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, everybody, depending on where you're connecting from. On behalf of the organizing team, I want to welcome you to this webinar on disaster displacement as loss and damage. My name is Lorenzo Guadagno with the platform on disaster displacement, and I will be moderating today's discussion. This is the third event in a series of virtual dialogues that IOM and IDMC through the Data Knowledge Working Group of the platform on disaster displacement have been organizing this year. The objective of these webinars have been to explore some challenging concepts that are related to human mobility, disasters, and environmental change, the data implications that they have, and the potential data approaches that can support, obviously, the research side of things, but also policy and operational work on this topic. In the first two events of this series, we looked at immobility and displacement indicators. For this one, we are focusing on loss and damage due to climate change, which are a key element of ongoing global policy discussions, and are also one element for which the consideration of displacement, migration, planned relocation is becoming increasingly important. And today we really want to explore how we can translate these global policy formulations, these global policy priorities into data work, what challenges exist to doing so, and how we can best produce actionable knowledge through our efforts on data. In order to do so, we're joined today by a fantastic panel of speakers, which includes Salim Haq, who is the director of the International Centre of Climate Change and Development and a professor at the Independent University of Bangladesh. And for the few who might not know him from one of these countless engagement in this topic, he's also an advisor for LDCs and for UNFCCC, sorry, negotiations, and the chair of the expert advisory group of the Climate Vulnerable Forum, among a host of other things. Then we'll have Adele Thomas, who is the senior fellow of the Climate Change Adaptation and Resilience Research Center at the University of the Bahamas, and a Caribbean science lead with climate analytics. And she focuses on adaptation, loss and damage in small island developing states, and has served as a lead author on several IPCC reports. Next will be Robert Oakes, who is a senior scientist on environment and migration at the UNU Institute for Environment and Human Security. He focuses on loss and damage, their perceived impacts, and the related mobility outcomes. Then we have Sarah Louise Nash, who is a political scientist at the University of Continuing Education in Austria, and focuses on climate politics and human mobility, especially in European nation states. And last but not least, David Rathall, who is an associate professor of natural hazards at Oregon State University and works on the impacts of climate change and other environmental challenges on livelihoods, habitability, and population movement. And he's also been a lead author of IPCC AR6, in particular coordinating the inclusion of all the human mobility topics in the assessment. So welcome to you all. Thanks for your availability to participating in today's discussion. And again, just before we start, perhaps let me point out a few very quick details. As you might have heard, connecting the event has been recording for everyone's except the panelists. The cameras and microphones will be off, but we do encourage you to use the chat as much as possible to ask questions, to provide feedback, because we really want to try to include that questions and those questions and that feedback into the discussion that we will have. We've tried to structure this as a very loose exchange among panelists on some identified topics, and we really kind of want to make it as much as possible an interaction with the audience as well. Last point, perhaps, we want to also get some key takeaways from this discussion that could be interesting for future policy work, for future discussions under the UNFCCC and in the upcoming different fora that deal with loss and damage. So we'll be sharing whatever we manage to compile after this webinar. And on this, let me really thank Hugo and Eric at PDD for their support in organizing this webinar, as well as all the colleagues at IOM and IDMC who have contributed to this. And without further ado, let's jump into discussion. And I will ask Professor Haq to provide us with a quick introduction of today's topic. So how displacement and mobility are relevant for loss and damage policy and operations, basically. Professor, you have the floor.
Great, thank you very much, Lorenzo, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody on this webinar. So I've just returned from 2 weeks in Bonn, where we had the intersessional meeting of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. And one of the topics that was under discussion was the issue of loss and damage from human-induced climate change. This is a particularly politically sensitive topic that the vulnerable countries have been pushing to be addressed for some years now, and we've made some progress there. Not enough progress in my view, but we've made some progress, and I'll just share a little bit about where we stand in the UNFCCC process, and in particular how this issue of mobility and displacement fits into the UNFCCC language of how we discuss these things. This is not normal language, by the way. This is UNFCCC speak. You have to learn it to understand it if you want to be in a UNFCCC gathering. So the first thing in the UN Framework Convention is we have climate change because of human-induced greenhouse gas emissions over the last century and a half. Global temperature has gone well above 1 degree centigrade. We've agreed in the Paris Agreement to keep it below 1.5, but we are rapidly losing that battle. Many people are predicting we'll go well over 1.5 very soon. Remains to be seen. In my view, it's still doable if we can get the requisite political will to actually do what we promised to do. And then we have a second order issue that arose from the emissions that have already happened, which is adapting to the impacts of climate change. Impacts are already happening. We need to adapt to them. So mitigation, which is reducing emissions, and adaptation, which is dealing with the impacts, are two well-established modalities in which we have agreed to tackle the impacts of climate change. But what has happened in the last year or two is that we have segued, and this is very much illustrated by the recent 6th assessment report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, who have, for the first time in 30 years of doing their reports, said, they used to say, if we don't take action, impacts will happen. They have now said impacts are already happening, and they are clearly attributable to human-induced climate change. And if you want an example, right now in my country, Bangladesh, tens of millions of people are displaced because of unprecedented flash floods that are occurring. Now, Bangladesh has a very, very good early warning system, and the deaths have been reduced to only a few dozen. By the way, in previous decades, they would be in the thousands. They are not anymore. But the displacement of people from their houses, from their homes, is enormous. And that is really what we are talking about when we talk about losses and damages from human-induced climate change. And these are now attributable to human-induced climate change, to the temperature rise that has already occurred. Now, in the UN Framework Convention, we have made some good steps in this direction. We, in COP19, the 19th Conference of Parties in Warsaw, we agreed to set up something called the Warsaw International Mechanism on Loss and Damage. We had an executive committee, they had a work program. We set up a task force on displacement. They did a very interesting and, in my view, very excellent report that was presented in COP24 in Katowice in Poland. Then in Madrid, in COP25, we agreed to set up something called the Santiago Network on Loss and Damage, which is another good step to do more research, more information gathering, more sharing of knowledge on what we are talking about when we talk about loss and damage, because not everybody knows what we're talking about. And then what happened in COP26 in Glasgow, the vulnerable countries wanted to set up, and we put up a very, very strong demand to set up what we called a facility for finance for loss and damage. And that was a bridge too far for the developed countries. They shut it down. They didn't allow it. They changed the Glasgow facility for finance for loss and damage into a Glasgow dialogue for finance for loss and damage. And the dialogue would continue for 3 years. And basically they'll talk about it, but they won't put any money up. Now, in Bonn last week, we had the first of these dialogues. There were 3 sessions. And in my view, the discussions were quite positive and constructive, but they're not leading anywhere. We don't know what's going to happen with these dialogues. They seem to be like glorified side events where we talk, but we don't do anything. And the demand from the developing countries was for this to be, loss and damage to be an agenda item in COP27, which will be in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt in November this year, but we weren't able to get that. We're not giving up. We're going to still push for it. But if there's no agenda item, then there's no decision to be made. It will just talk, but we won't decide or do any action. So that is really where we stand in the UNFCCC process from the perspective of vulnerable developing countries, which I certainly share. It is very inadequate and not at all where we need to be, considering the emergency and the crisis that we are facing everywhere, every day. Developed countries as well as developing countries are facing displacement due to human-induced climate change. Now, the fact of migration and movement and mobility predates climate change by millennia. You know, human beings came from Africa and moved into other continents millennia ago. So movement is very, very old. But forced displacement because of human-induced climate change is a new phenomena, a current phenomena. It is already happening, and we are going to have to figure out ways how to deal with it. So for those of you who have been working on mobility in the non-climate context for some time, I would encourage you to join the climate context, where, as I said, a little bit of climate jargon will be required, because we don't use the terms climate migrants or climate refugees. It's always displacement due to human-induced climate change, and that's it. And so hopefully we can broaden the discussions and raise levels of awareness and be practical about how to deal with it. I think, you know, nobody is against doing something about it, but it's the context in which they do it that we need to shift the thinking of. And the academics and researchers on this particular webinar, I hope will be in a position to add to that knowledge and to share a better understanding of what are we talking about. There are many nuances to this issue. There's, you know, rapid onset events, there's slow onset events, there's economic loss and damage, non-economic loss and damage. So, you know, I won't go into all the complexity of these issues, but they are complex. I accept that, and that we need to tease them out and prepare them for policymakers, decision makers, and for the general public in a manner that people can understand. Maybe I'll stop there, Lorenzo, and I'm happy to come back later.
Well, thank you very much. Thanks for that great introduction, really, for setting the stage on so many things that we hope to be able to touch upon during this webinar. Definitely some of the elements that you've discussed, the economic, non-economic, perhaps also the sudden versus slow onset context based on the experience of our different speakers. As perhaps I was saying before, we really want to use this exchange to tackle some perhaps a little bit challenging concepts within all this discussion that can help us present better this work at the policy level, and also perhaps orient a little bit our data and operations on this. And perhaps let us start with one fundamental question about all this, which is really in whether or not we can talk about displacement in the context of climate change as a loss or a damage, basically. So perhaps it's a very fundamental one. It's a very kind of basic one, but it speaks to something that Professor Aki were mentioning, right? There is a fundamental ambiguity in how we speak about displacement in this context. On one end, it's obviously a symptom of suffered or perceived impacts. On the other hand, it's also a way for people to avoid loss and damage, right? It's the result of life-saving choices. So how do we consider this ambiguity within loss and damage assessment? How do we actually formalize this ambiguity and make sure that whenever we are speaking about displacement as a loss and damage, we're doing it unpacking and considering this double nature in a way? And perhaps I would ask Sarah to start on this, and then everyone else to chime in. Over to you, Sarah.
Thank you very much, Lorenzo. So I guess maybe to open my short contribution here, I'd say that I'm coming from quite an unusual perspective in lots of these discussions, in that I'm a political scientist. So I don't look at movements of people. I'm not working with that kind of data. I'm looking at the policy discussions and analysing this kind of political context itself. So I work a lot with kind of concepts, meaning making, how terminology becomes attached to different meanings, but also the impacts that this can have on governance processes and policy making. And I think it's often an area that's overlooked and one that we need to be thinking of more. So not just what do we mean with our concepts and with our terminology that we pick, but how is this taken up in policy communities and then worked with? Because that obviously impacts what these policy frameworks can then actually be. So with that in mind, two things kind of jumped out of me from the question itself that I think we need to kind of tease out before I go on to the core bit of my answer. The first is obviously the use of the word displacement. For me, this automatically suggests we're talking about more or less forced movements or more forced movements, and not just about people moving. Okay, so people being forced to move rather than just movement in general. And I think that's very important when we're working with policy communities, especially ones who might generally be against people moving, and that we work with this distinction and definitely flag that up. The second thing that kind of struck me was obviously the words loss and damage, which thanks to the introduction from Professor Huck, I don't need to go into in such detail, but it's automatically a flag for me that we're talking about the policy context of the UNFCCC, of the climate negotiations at the global level. So that's kind of the context within which I'm answering this, I guess. First off, though, I think there's one thing that I kind of need to put out there, and I think that's especially for those of us working in the global north, that is the need to listen to affected people when it comes to conceptual and terminological questions like this. So if people who are experiencing displacement that's connected to climate change come to us and say, this is a loss for me, this is a damage, we need to listen to that and not decide, well, no, our conceptual framework tells us something different. Actually, it's not a loss. Let's look at it a different way. And I think that's a hugely important thing that we need to foreground. And I think migration scholars tend to be very good at doing, but maybe less so from the kind of climate policy scene where I am. So I think that's something I wanted to foreground there. But to make 10.2 kind of really brief points on the core answer now that I've set up. The first one would be a conceptual point. So in UNFCCC terms, we've obviously not just got these kind of three broad streams of work, but actually the work on human mobilities has moved within them during the time it's been looked at in the climate negotiations. So if we look briefly back to 2010, when human mobilities were talked about for the first time in an agreed upon document from the UNFCCC, it was actually within the Cancun adaptation framework. And it was framed as displacement, migration, and planned relocation under the umbrella term of human mobilities. This is obviously a different setup. For now, where we're working within the institutional setting of loss and damage, displacement is much more front-loaded. And this is obviously logical, right? So if we're talking about loss and damage, we're going to be talking about more forced types of movements. So I think this is kind of a logical point, but it's also important to know that, you know, these terms can move around and be worked within different constellations within different parts of the negotiations. So this doesn't preclude also working on less forced forms of mobilities within the climate negotiations context, maybe just in a slightly different constellation. So I think that's also important to remember. My second point is more of a political one. As we've already heard, loss and damage is, you know, I think probably the most controversial part of the climate negotiations currently, at least that's my feeling. You know, the Paris Agreement shows this by including specific caveats around loss and damage that we're not considering liability, compensation, etc. And there's an argument to be made that actually the term loss and damage can be kind of quite a sterile, euphemistic way to bracket out questions of accountability and responsibility. So I think this is obviously one of the disadvantages of working on displacement via this work stream, is that it's hugely controversial and it's going to be really difficult to get to those kind of core questions. We saw it coming out in the discourse a little bit in the Glasgow negotiations, where the First Minister of Scotland started talking about you know, how if loss and damage funding their government were putting up being form of reparations and not charity, which I think was of an interesting discourse, but probably quite a symbolic one in that moment. On the flip side of that, there's kind of advantages, I think, though, of the focus being mainly on displacement. And I've seen this through my work with politicians from across the political spectrum here in Europe, who are much more comfortable talking about displacement and ways to avert it and minimize it than they are talking about potential migration into their countries. And while, of course, this is hugely problematic, it does give a kind of into certain conversations that we can then start with these important policymakers. Yeah, I think I'll leave that in there for now and let others join into the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. And I would invite anyone else just to put up their hands physically or virtually and unmute themselves and just go ahead. Adele, yeah.
Thank you, and thanks, Sarah. I am a geographer, but I just spent some time in a conference with political scientists last week, so I was able to decipher what you were saying. So I'm coming at this as a geographer and also as a person that is from the Bahamas, where we have experienced firsthand displacement. And I've done some studies looking at people that have been displaced from these catastrophic hurricanes, some of them my own family and friends. So from my perspective, displacement is absolutely loss and damage. If we think of loss and damage as harm from the impacts of climate change, displacement definitely has both short and long-term harms for those people that have to move from their homes. Displacement is a traumatic experience. Imagine being ripped from your home, from your community, for who knows how long. There are economic costs of being displaced from your home. Where do you live? The loss of income from jobs that are no longer there. There's non-economic losses, so health of people that are displaced have been shown to be affected, safety of women in shelters, the loss of community, extended displacement and its implications for education of children, loss of personal items. All of these things are examples of both economic and non-economic loss and damage. So from my perspective, just very simply, displacement is absolutely a form of loss and damage. And I will be brief and end it there. Thanks.
Thank you. David?
Thanks very much. That was a really interesting set of framing items, both from Sarah and Adele. So this is just a reflection from the IPCC perspective, sort of high level, the thought coming in from our assessment of mobility, migration, displacement issues. We were tasked with this thought exercise to think about, many of you are familiar with the reasons for concern in the IPCC process. And in this assessment, we were tasked to think about representative key risks. And so these are just capital R, big risks that we can think about associated with climate change. And so these are food security issues or conflict that might arise, famine. And so I was part of the team that was tasked to develop RKR, the representative key risk for mobility. And I just wanted to reflect to you what we came up with, because I think it's very relevant to the discussion, the framing discussion here. So this is mobility represents severe, intolerable risk at the point when local determinations are made about the loss of habitability, and when people cannot secure safe, tolerable alternatives for locating their lives and communities. So that sentence weighs a ton. But a few things that we can draw out from that are local determinations, a sense of agency that people might have, a subjective determination about whether people think the place continues to be habitable. And so what we think about this, the kind of emphasis is the loss of habitability. And so then that begs a whole set of questions about what habitability means, and we can talk about that, I guess, at other points in the panel. But just a framing idea from the IPCC.
Thank you. And Robert, perhaps you want to build on this as well?
Thanks. Yeah, just on this issue, is it a loss or is it a damage? I think I'm generally in favor of a loss and damage framing as opposed to an adaptation framing. Of course, it depends, but displacement, there's no choice. Therefore, outcomes tend to be less beneficial or worse. I think that we can have forms of displacements which are losses, which are damages, which can become losses. So without going through the terminology, which I'm not as strong as others here, a loss is gone, a damage is some sort of injury which could be recovered from. But if you keep sustaining damages, it becomes a loss, but also some effects of being displaced. So if you're displaced away from your home, your cultural home, you have this loss of sense of identity, and can you ever get that back? Perhaps there are ways of getting it back, but I think all forms of loss and damage are not equal, and some of these damages can become losses. So I think it is interesting to sometimes separate these two terms, because I think they were created and used for a reason. And it's interesting to think which of these are longer term, or which of these could affect someone for 5, 10 years, or all of their life, or even for a community or a culture. It could go on for generations even. That's all for now, thanks.
Thank you. And perhaps then just bouncing back to the second part of the question that was on screen initially, which was more about the assessment of losses and damages, right? That some countries have actually started doing. There are examples of loss and damage assessments. And perhaps do you have any insights on how to integrate potential occurrence of displacement due to climate change impacts in those assessments, as well as all the dimensions that you were already mentioning, right? That Adele started listing, that Robert, you built upon with all these different elements through which communities are affected, right? Is there any example from the work that you've been either performing directly or that you revised for instance, putting together a chapter in the IPCC report that speaks to this? Or Professor Huck, if you want to also jump in on this, just feel free.
So let me kick off a little bit on definitional issues. In a very real sense, the reason we use the term loss and damage is because we are not allowed to use the term liability and compensation, which is what we are talking about. Those words are taboo. They have been officially tabooed by the United States of America. We are not allowed to use those words. And we have agreed now a euphemism, loss and damage, with no definition. It's a phrase. The working definition that I tend to use with my research is to use the word loss to refer to something that is irrevocably gone. A human life lost will not come back no matter how much money you give the family. A biodiversity species lost, an ecosystem lost, are lost forever. They are gone. On the other hand, damage, as Robert has just said, is recoverable. Your house is damaged, you can fix the house. Your road is damaged, you can fix the road. You lose one crop, you can get another crop. So there are elements of damage that can be repaired with funding, with money, with compensation. But losses can't. Losses are irreparable loss. That's one categorization. The second element that we need to keep in mind is a very clear distinction between the rapid onset events like floods, cyclones, hurricanes, which cause severe damage. As I mentioned, the floods happening in Bangladesh have been very severe, as opposed to slow onset events, particularly sea level rise. And that is a very, very slow emergency. And again, I'll cite my country, Bangladesh, where we have a very low-lying coastal zone with tens of millions of people living, with salinity intruding into the groundwater, into the surface water. People are having to, drink saline water. The agriculture irrigation water has become saline. They're adapting to it. They're changing to shrimp. They're doing rainwater harvesting. They're doing all kinds of adaptations, but there are limits to adaptation. They're not going to be able to adapt forever. And every day, some families simply give up and they decide to move. And there's no, humanitarian agency like the Oxfam or the UN OCHA system that comes as they do when there is a hurricane or a flood. That's when they all come, and it depends on whether or not CNN covers the event, then they come. If CNN doesn't cover the event, then they don't come. But nevertheless, the humanitarian actors come in after rapid onset events. They don't take into account slow onset events. And in particular, sea level rise is a quintessentially human-induced climate change problem. It did not exist before humans started causing the problem. And humans have caused the problem, and sea level rise is now something that will continue. But by the way, sea level rise is one of the things that will not end by 2100. It will go on for centuries. It's unstoppable. But we have to deal with it. We have to prepare for it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I don't see any further hand up.
I can come in a bit, on the loss and damage assessments. So I know in the developing world context, after we have these extreme events, there's often, well, the most extreme of events will get something that's called a post-disaster needs assessment. And that's when you'll have experts that will come in and work with local government to try and figure out what the cost of that extreme event was. So they'll look at, what were the costs of damages to infrastructure, what were losses to specific sectors, agriculture, et cetera. And with that, they'll come up with a figure as to how much this extreme event cost. So in the Bahamas for Hurricane Dorian, and I'm going to be drawing on this example a lot, the cost that came up was $3.4 billion. But what we found from our research in looking at these post-disaster needs assessments is that they don't capture what the costs of displacement are for those displaced people. They're done within a few months after the event, so they don't capture the long-term costs of these events. And so current methodologies that many developing countries are using to look at the cost of extreme events really do not capture the costs of displacement, either for the government that's tasked with trying to help them long term, or for the people themselves that have to use their own money to try and survive and to rebuild a life after they've been displaced.
Yeah, thanks a lot for that. And I think this speaks also to the very last point that we will be addressing today, which is about exactly all these impacts and how do we address these impacts as well. David, I saw your hand go up and down quickly.
I don't want to stall the discussion, and maybe we need to move to the next question, but this seemed relevant in light of what Salim had just offered on the case of Bangladesh and what Adele offered on these post-disaster assessments that occur, so of loss and damage. And so making the link between mobility and loss and damage is very important methodologically, empirically, if we're going to try to predict mobility futures. And so I've been involved in some assessments of these types. And one of these was in Bangladesh, where we came up with some pretty counterintuitive findings. And they seem like they might be worth reporting here. So that we linked losses and damages in agriculture that people and assets that people had experienced in the course of flooding and then subsequent salinity problems. So these are agricultural losses. And so we then use these losses and the behaviors that resulted, these empirically, these household survey, very detailed household survey data to calibrate an agent-based model that would predict future mobility decisions well into the future as sea level rise continued to make these problems worse. And what this model showed was a super counterintuitive finding that actually as losses and damages accumulate in people's livelihoods, that we saw movement towards the coast, that people were moving actually towards climate hazards. And this is counterintuitive. It was surprising to us as migration scholars, a whole team of us who work on this issue, and we were pretty surprised. But I think it's always neat when you come up with research that surprises you. I like to be involved in that sort of thing. But any guesses why that might be? That people would be moving towards hazards? I guess it's just a question. I can give you the answer, but it's less exciting. It's I like to hear what people think. So people are in rural areas that rely on agriculture would substitute their livelihoods that are lost with urban wages, and so there's this transition from agricultural modes of living to wage-based modes of living, a sort of industrialized labor market that we all know very well. And where are those wages? They're in cities. And where are cities? They're on the coast. And so as climate hazards become worse and worse, this is what we can expect, is actually people moving towards danger. And so this is when we start to calibrate our assessments on losses and damages, then we get a really interesting picture. And I think that's a key kind of finding here.
That's quite interesting indeed, because then it affects also what the long-term prospects, right, for more displacement, more impacts will be. So thanks for sharing that one. So then I guess, since there doesn't seem to be any more feedback from you, perhaps we can move to the following question. I hope you can see the screen again. This was about how the language on averting, minimizing, and addressing losses and damages in general has been translated to refer specifically to displacement, right? So we hear a lot about averting, minimizing, and addressing displacement as well. So the question here is, to what extent can displacement actually be averted, especially as we push towards those adaptation limits that you have been, Professor Hack, speaking about, and perhaps, David, you have also referred to some extent, right, in this last intervention. And also, can we take any specific measure to avoid displacement that we would not take already to avoid loss of lives, loss of livelihoods, protect ecosystems, protect structures, etc.? And do we have evidence for what these interventions might be and how we need to basically support specific disaster risk reduction or climate change adaptation work? And perhaps, Robert, do you want to go first with this one? If that's
certainly, yes, please. Yeah, so we've talked a little bit about terminology already, and this avert, address, minimize, avert, minimize, address, sorry, wording that's within the UNFCCC. And I suspect, as Salim was saying, with the kind of loss and damage wording, it's terms which evolved that people could agree upon and perhaps don't exactly say what we mean. And I think there's still maybe some thinking to be done on negotiations on what these means. But in terms of avert, means to stop. And if we compare avert to minimizing, it's kind of more absolute, and perhaps we have to think about what this means in terms of climate change and mitigation. So displacement is more or less a function of the hazard, which in this case relates to climate change. And as we know, under climate change, most displacement relates to too much water from storms or floods. And we know that we have more intense rainfall or more unpredictable rainfall, and possibly more storms depending where you are in the world, but less predictable and more water, essentially. So hazards will be increasing, and also, as Salim said, we're locked into this in the system. There will be these changes for decades because of the CO2 which we are pumping into the atmosphere and already have pumped into the atmosphere. So these hazards will increase, and at the same time, we've got large populations who are exposed, and of those populations, there is a lot of vulnerability, and of course, this is mostly in the global south. And then when we think about, can it be averted? I suppose I can't really just talk about the hazard. I think we need to talk about other processes. So this can sort of be thought about it on the supply side or the demand side in terms of how this relates to displacement, or within the mobilities literature, a way of thinking about this is the aspirations and capabilities of mobility. So aspirations are going to be affected because of climate change impacts. So people will want to move. So this is, people will want to move because of the climate impacts, and this is particularly related to their economic status. If they're vulnerable, for example, they'll be less likely to be able to absorb these impacts, and will want to move. But then the capabilities, can they actually move, and can they move in a more agential manner than to be displaced? This is an important question, really. So what is necessary is to reduce the desire or the want to needs on the one hand, but on the other hand also enable more productive forms of mobility than displacement. So if we go back to the Bangladesh example that we've been discussing, if the river bank is eroding, then we might get a family which have a more secure livelihood, might be able to sell some cows, move inland, move away from the risk, and that means that they haven't been displaced. A family who are trapped, as is sometimes used in the literature, a family who aren't able to sell some cattle to get some capital to move away, they might then be more affected by the next time that there's an erosion, and this family might be displaced. So what we've got to think about are specific interventions which can actually improve the ability to adapt. So therefore you're able to absorb the impacts and not be displaced, or you're able to move away in a more controlled manner. So if you can move voluntarily, you have control about the whether, the where, when, how of actually moving, then you won't be displaced. And then we come back to the kind of original question we're discussing about loss and damage. If you're moving and you're able to take some agency in how you move, then the losses and damages are reduced. Just so in terms of not needing to be displaced, I suppose this comes into, yeah, disaster risk reduction and building resilience, but also social development more generally, education, economic growth, healthcare, all of these things, political democracy. But then in terms of enabling migration as opposed to displacement, it's about increasing people's social capital, financial capital, network so they can move, credit so they can move. It's about creating networks and maybe even regional agreements where people can move between states. This is happening in the Pacific at the moment. They're trying to produce a regional framework so people can move between affected countries. Then just moving on quickly in terms of second part, yeah, displacement risk assessments are certainly useful and improving, and any sort of assessments or model, David mentioned models can be useful for giving an indication of what may happen. And I think we have to accept that policymakers will always be interested in such models or projections or data about the future or about the present that can be used for the future. So it's incumbent upon people working in NGOs in the UN and universities to try and build and improve these ways of producing data. This means that countries or NGOs or the UN are better able to prepare and therefore prevent, and also perhaps seek funds. So maybe we'll talk about quantifying displacement later, but if you can quantify what might happen in the future and the cost of it, then you're more likely to be able to secure funds to able to deal with it. But yeah, essentially in terms of displacement risk, so Internal Displacement Monitoring Centre produces some nice data. I think what's key is to try and bring together data on the climate risk, data on the land or the sea, so bathymetry data about the shape of the ocean, in order to project what will happen if we're talking about a storm hitting land. But then it's also really important to consider socioeconomic data, where the people are living, of course, their capabilities, their access to the resources. What is more difficult is to consider this kind of the subjective idea that David's mentioned, how people will interpret risk information and how they will actually respond. But I think it's really important to combine mapping, climate data, climate projections, quantitative data, qualitative data to get a broader picture of this. And things are improving. I think there's more to be done, but I think there are good steps being made along this line. I'll finish there for now.
Thank you for getting such a complex and answer to what was, I think, a little bit of a difficult question, maybe. So perhaps if there are others that want to jump in as well, Adele, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. It's so interesting hearing these different perspectives based on the literature that we engage with. So for me, coming from being involved in UNFCCC, AVERT to me is code for mitigation. So then this directly brings up the importance of the 1.5 degree temperature goal in the Paris Agreement. So if we want to avert displacement, then we absolutely need to stick to 1.5. And then this is backed up by the science. So the latest IPCC AR6 reports, as well as the special report on 1.5 degrees, talk about 1.5 degrees being a critical threshold where we see these hazards that lead to displacement really escalating. So increased intensity of cyclones, of flooding, of sea level rise, of heat waves. These are all the hazards that are leading to displacement now and will be increased as we exceed 1.5. And 1.5 is also a critical threshold when we think about limits to adaptation. So we are already seeing coastal communities, agricultural communities facing soft limits to adaptation at current levels of warming of 1.1. And 1.5 is also a critical threshold when it comes to hard limits of adaptation. So certain ecosystems that are important that provide ecosystem services, such as protecting us from flooding, protecting us from cyclones. At 1.5, these lose their feasibility. So things like coral reefs, mangroves, etc., are no longer viable for ecosystem-based adaptation. And then 1.5 is also a critical threshold for irreversible impacts of climate change. We see this particularly for sea level rise and the long-term implications that has for coastal communities and small islands, where displacement and then migration will become an inevitability. So from my perspective, AVERT is mitigation, and we absolutely need to keep to the 1.5 agreement in the Paris Agreement. Thanks.
David, and then Sarah.
Mute. Okay. Yeah, I want to just sort of emphasize that, and not to repeat anything that Adele said, but just to underscore, it's so important, this issue. Oftentimes we think about this stuff and we're divorced from the key climate questions. And so if we're trying to figure out displacement issues and where loss and damage is going to be related to human mobility, not all climate hazards are the same. And so, in the 6th assessment, we looked at all of the potential livelihood risks associated with all of the different climate hazards that we're expecting over the coming century, over different emission scenarios. And really, there are a couple of clusters of climate hazards that stand out far and above the others. And those have been mentioned, but it really, I think it deserves underscoring. So the heat extremes. People will not be able to live in certain places, and I think without technological interventions like air conditioning, so this will become a problem and will affect issues of displacement. So these temperature extremes are the first key category. The second one are the basket of climate hazards associated with sea level rise, and again, geographically there are specific areas where this is much more a problem than others. And if we want to understand displacement and habitability concerns, we can zero in on areas of the globe where this is an issue. And we've already talked about Bangladesh and other deltaic countries where the sea level rise issue is going to be, under different scenarios. And as Salim said, under all scenarios, really the scenarios start to look the same for sea level rise, at least between now and mid-century to 2100 as well. So then the last one is drought, because people can't grow food under conditions of drought, especially when we lose a season of agricultural production. And so then we can set aside some of the other issues, which are still significant concerns, like ocean acidification, et cetera, et cetera. But really these three baskets, these three areas of climate hazards, temperature extremes, sea level rise, drought, those are really where we should focus. They focus the mind on questions of displacement. I don't know, that's a reflection from the IPCC again.
But it's interesting because then we're talking about this kind of slow onset in which grappling with what is displacement, what is not displacement, and how do we address it, probably, as Professor Huck was saying before, are more difficult to address, right? And so we know that these are relevant, but it's also more challenging operational and policy context, probably, for all the relevant work.
Well, sure. Another issue here is that these, so sea level rise means to one society something totally different to another society also encountering the same set of challenges. And so yeah, it's a good point.
Well, thanks. That is also a very good point. So Sarah and then Salim.
Okay, thank you. I guess I just wanted to reflect on a couple of challenges with the avert word that I've kind of felt in my own communications around these issues, and that I've kind of seen maybe work or not work so well within policy communications and policy communities as well. The first one is avoiding displacement always being, with the flip side of displacement always being immobilities. And Robert touched on this at the start, right? So it's not always a case of averting displacement means that everyone stays where they were. And I think that's a really important, I think for many of us, this seems quite obvious, but I promise you it isn't always that case. And I'm often confronted with this kind of assumption that, if people aren't displaced, then they're in a kind of refugee sudden onset type situation, then they're going to be staying where they are. And I think it's really important to kind of break down some of the complexities in that somewhat. Just to kind of, be showing more of the realities of the situations. And the second problem, I guess, that I face is walking this really fine line between the danger of underplaying the impact of displacement on people's lives, or the severity of the climate impacts on people's lives, and the danger of overemphasizing the inevitability of particular displacements. And I find this a really hard kind of challenge to actually negotiate. Because on the one hand, you want to be bringing in research, you want to be talking about things like the multi-causality of mobility decisions, that social, economic, political factors, historical factors are all playing a role as well as climate impacts, and that there are different types of mobility. But sometimes that can be quite hard to do without downplaying that kind of climate component, I find, or without it coming across that way. But on the other side, if you really, really talk about that climate component, you really talk about the dangers of displacements, it's often assumed that actually particular displacements are inevitable. And I think there's a lot of scholarship on this around Pacific Island states in particular, where then, of course, there's the danger that states won't want to be contributing adaptation funding to communities where, they will be inevitably displaced anyway. And I think this is just a really difficult challenge to negotiate. So I'm not sure if that's an answer to the question and the conundrum, but more of a challenge is to negotiate on the way of working towards an answer, I think.
Salim, do you want to go ahead?
Yes, so this is a very interesting discussion, and I think underlines the complexity of all the issues involved in tackling these particular connected issues of displacement and loss and damage. Let me just share a little bit about an initiative that my Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina in Bangladesh has taken, which is not actually in the context of climate change, but it overlaps with climate change. It's in the context of just general rural to urban migration that has been taking place primarily for economic reasons and primarily of young people leaving the villages and moving to towns. And what she has proposed, and this is a very major slogan of her party and her government, is make every village into a town. And so make the village have all the facilities of employment, education that young people desire when they want to go to towns, and give it to them there so they don't have to migrate. And now with climate change, that is becoming an even more important dimension, because we don't want people to necessarily be forced to move. So the question is, how long can we help them stay where they are and postpone the potential inevitability of people being forced to move? People don't want to move. So, the presumption that they want to move is wrong. On the other hand, there are multiple factors in decisions to move, and particularly for young people, that really is an important element to it. So, we have to try different things. That's basically what I'm saying. There are different aspects, and learn from each other.
Thank you. Thanks for all those elements. As Adele was saying, it's really interesting to listen to all these different entry points and all your different perspectives from different fields. And this idea of averting meaning more than just having people stay in place and kind of having people just basically increasing the level of agency, right, of this decision. I think it's really practically very, very interesting. And the kind of interventions that Salim was mentioning at last, like of how we just improve access to services, how we just improve access to livelihoods, etc. That's a key element of this, right? And it has to do with internal movements as well. So we're not necessarily focusing on the kind of cross-border elements of all this. It's really about just making sure that whatever mobility decisions taken, even the short distance one, even the mobility ones, are taken with a higher level of agency. So that's really interesting as a way of framing it, I think. If there is nothing else on this, and I don't see any further hand up, perhaps we can move to the next one then. And this one is about the second element, right? It's about the minimizing. And so this is about how we inform work towards minimizing displacement, minimizing the impacts of displacement, and to what extent we can use displacement models, displacement information to guide relevant preparedness work that can actually looks at displacement and its impacts. And how does this work then can inform a response and recovery to the impacts of climate change, to the different disasters that are related to this, that actually minimize the duration, the impacts of displacement and on the affected persons in general. So perhaps I'll start, David, to start with this one.
Yeah, this is a really interesting, complicated question. So, we've spoken in the panel about migration, displacement, mobility, immobility in the context of climate change hazards as being this complex, emergent phenomenon that it's a process that occurs amidst a underlying transformation. And so the signal that this transformation is occurring is the mobility that we see. What it is in response to is some loss and damage that happens in that underlying social and environmental context. And so the challenge is to generate rules that would govern these sorts of mobility decisions, and how and the ways in which mobility outcomes are sort of preferred and unpreferred. So this is each one that we've just set out a whole bunch of landmines here for us to step on as we think about these things. And the first one is, so we've mentioned agency. We've sort of circled around that one. One of the things in the sixth assessment that we came out as we were, Robert McLemmon and Helen Adams, Elizabeth Gilmore, and lots of other luminaries who work on this issue. One of the things we really wanted to drive was the importance of the question of human agency and making decisions about mobility in the context of losses and damages. And when people do have power to make decisions about whether they want to stay or whether they want to go, then outcomes are usually preferable. And so that seems like a key lesson here for minimizing harmful outcomes, is just maximizing agency. And how do we do that? There are lots of things we could all say. Making entitlements that are portable, entitlements like access to education, healthcare, et cetera, that can move with you from context to context, so that people are guaranteed these sorts of things no matter where they go. And then the location of choice is sort of preferential to a person. But I want to take a step back and think about something a little bit more. So the question, what we're talking about here in this, I think the essential issue in this question is studying, predicting, understanding, anticipating where displacement could happen. And I think I prefer to think about a shifting habitability. And so, and I mentioned this before, there was some effort to integrate this thinking in the 6th assessment. So what is habitability? We might think of it as the environmental conditions that would support the multi-generational project of sustainable development. So that enables people to remain in place safely, engaged in a set of livelihoods, in communities where there are structures that exist to manage risk. So habitability, when we think about a threat to habitability, it can be, it can occur when any of these pillars start to deteriorate. Again, it's safety, physical safety, livelihoods, and then the capacity to organize, to manage risk. Or we might say adapt to local environmental change. So then habitability is really, we've mentioned that there's 3 specific hazard sets that really pose threats to the essential issues of human physical safety, the safety of the human body to live to its life expectancy, that threaten livelihoods, and then people's ability to organize. And those are heat extremes, sea level rise, and all the hazards associated with those, and then drought. And when we start to zero in on the places on the planet where those converge, there's specific areas of concern and there's specific populations of concern. And so I just might, we don't have to study the entire planet and to study everywhere where mobility and displacement might occur, if we know that these specific hazards, when they combine, elevate the risk of displacement, of loss and damage first, and then displacement second. And there are specific regions, South Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, where we really start to see the small island developing states, which has already been mentioned. These are the places of greatest concern, and we can start to really imagine how these hazards combine to pose problems. And I guess something I just like to sort of end on here is, well, maybe that's enough. Maybe we could I can just end my comments on just thinking about habitability as the essential question and how we might better understand the conditions that support local habitability.
Thank you. And I really, really think of the first thing that you said, that mobility, it's a signal of underlying loss and damages as one of the key elements for understanding this. So thanks for that framing. Does anyone want to rebound on anything that David said, or just started add some other perspectives on this? We're talking about the minimizing element of Adele.
So for me, minimizing is adaptation, the second component of averting, minimizing, and addressing loss and damage. So we need to do much more to adapt, and that is related to what David is saying about habitability. I always have a problem with that word, of being able to continue to live in a particular place. And just bringing it back to the UNFCCC and the IPCC, we see that there is a need for much more investment in adaptation. Most of the money is going towards mitigation, and this has been, you know, in the recent SBs and at COP26, an area where there's an increasing need for focus. We're looking at the global goal on adaptation. What actually is it? How do we even assess what levels of adaptation that we're doing? We know that we're grossly inadequate, but how do we say where we're at? And the global stock take, which is just looking at where we're at in terms of both adaptation, mitigation, finance. So for me to minimize displacement, I'm not going to get into the impacts of displacement, but just displacement itself, we need to be doing much more in the adaptation space. And then also taking into account that there are limits to adaptation and that we're seeing these now. They will increase as temperatures rise. They will increase as there are less resources available for adaptation, which then will result in actual displacement. And picking up a bit on what Sarah was saying there about the inevitability of displacement from the small island perspective, I definitely hear that and feel that there are definitely places where we feel as if not just displacement, but migration seems inevitable. Yeah, so I'll end it there. I think minimizing displacement is all about increasing urgently our adaptation efforts. Thanks.
Robert, thank you, Adan.
Yeah, just very briefly, I think that within, I think Adele's right, it's generally about adaptation, but I think there's also this idea about facilitating better forms of mobility, and there's this idea of facilitating or promoting safe, regular and orderly forms of mobility, which sounds on paper like a good thing and generally is a good thing, but I think we just need to be aware that this can be used to possibly restrict flows of people, and it's kind of important to realize that when we're talking about stopping people from moving, that somehow these can transfer into other processes and ideas whereby people's ability and rights to move might actually be restricted. So, you know, these terms, when we unpack them, they can be a little bit more nuanced than we think, or that nuance was built into them, into the agreements and the wordings, because these are what some states were considering also.
Thank you. And Salim?
Yes, just picking up on that point, just again reflecting on the 3 sessions of the Glasgow Dialogue on Finance for Loss and Damage that we had in Bonn just a week or so ago. There was a very strong effort by the developed countries to portray their funding for adaptation, which was for adaptation, as also minimizing loss and damage. So they were double counting what they were funding for adaptation as also minimizing loss and damage, although it's not explicitly for minimizing loss and damage, it's explicitly for adaptation, but they want to double count it. And I think, you know, that's something that we, the developing countries in the further sessions of the Glasgow Dialogue, are going to insist on not being allowed anymore. We are now segueing into addressing losses and damages that have already occurred. Adaptation does not overlap with that. That is now dealing with the problem after it has happened. And so that really is where we need to be looking at. And when you come to that, then there's not much money flowing for that at all.
Thank you very much. And that actually brings us very nicely to the very last question or topic that we want to touch, which is about addressing the impacts, right? Perhaps before we dive into that, I would just point your attention to the chat where Michelle has shared some of the documents that Professor Rack was referring to in the very first intervention that we made about the work of the TFD, the Task Force on Displacement under the Warsaw International Mechanism. As well as a general comment that kind of speaks a lot to what we have been discussing now with agency and different forms of mobility, right? And outcomes potentially be much better if the decision is less forced, basically, the decisions move. And in particular now, human mobility does have positive impacts or can have positive impacts for adaptation to the impacts of climate change. So thanks a lot for both those comments. And again, we'll just move to the last question. We have about at this point 15 minutes to discuss it, which it's not enough to come to any conclusion, but at least to scratch the surface and perhaps for you to give us a little bit of a pointer on how to progress on this. And the last question is about, again, addressing the impacts of displacement. In particular, we've heard now all these diversity of ways in which displacement affects the lives of people, economic, non-economic manners. So how can we go about truly quantifying these impacts? And perhaps also how do we measure, but also how do we anticipate potential impacts that displacement can have, right? As we assess potential losses and damages, and not just wait for these to take place. So I'll ask perhaps Adele to go first on this one, if that's okay for you.
Yeah, sure. So I think we have much more work to do when it comes to assessing and quantifying the negative impacts from displacement for displaced people. So as I mentioned before, we in the developing world, we do these post-disaster needs assessments, which are grossly inadequate. In the research community, you may have some research that's done on particular events that have led to displacement. So for example, some of the work that I've done looking at displacement after Hurricane Dorian, because that was the biggest displacement event that we've had in the Bahamas. And you'll find like these specific case studies of displacement and what it's meant for specific populations. David mentioned some of the work that he's done as well in Bangladesh. But we need a much more comprehensive approach. So whenever these events, both the extreme events, but also the slow onset events are resulting in displacement, we actually need to be assessing what are the implications for displaced people. And it can't just be this case study approach that we've been going about it. And for quantification, we have the economic loss and damage, which needs to take into account the immediate costs that affect displaced people, which I was talking about earlier, the cost of trying to find someplace else to live, the cost of lost income from jobs that are no longer there, livelihoods that are no longer there, but also the long-term costs. So how long is it taking you to recover? When can you get back, if you get back to where you were before? But in addition to quantifying those economic costs, we need much better methodologies in how to assess the non-economic loss and damage that comes along with displacement. So the trauma, and we were at the SBs and it came up that we need to be paying much more attention to the psychological impacts of climate change. Even for young people, like what does their future look like? That's a serious non-economic loss. The health implications, the education for children, loss of personal items, loss of community, loss of sense of place, all of this which comes along with displacement, all of this needs to be assessed. And I think we have quite a long way to go. And it reflects sort of the attention that has been paid towards averting and minimizing loss and damage rather than addressing loss and damage. And so, in my opinion, this is someplace where we need lots of work. Thanks, and I'll end it there.
Thank you very much. And while I see Salim's hand up, perhaps I'll also ask you all, how do we go beyond this kind of case study approach that you were mentioning there? Over to Salim for your
Great. Thank you very much. So just a point of information to share with you. Last week in Bonn, the Climate Vulnerable Forum, which is now consists of 55 developing countries, they brought out a report on economic losses and damages from climate change in their countries in the past. And a broad generalization is that on average, countries lost 20% of GDP because of climate change related impacts. And in some cases, well over 50%. So these are very severe economic losses. And as Adele says, it doesn't even capture the displacement and non-economic losses, which are also extremely important. So the CVF countries are going to be doing another report, which they hope to publish before the COP, which will look forward, do some projections into the future on these. But something I would recommend that we might think about doing is seeing whether we can include displacement as a parameter in these studies, because it's not. It's just pure economic loss and damage. That's all they're looking at. But I think, you know, I would be very interested in joining forces with anybody who's interested in doing more. My own interest and my center's interest is much more on the non-economic loss and damage. So it's not in the quantification of it, but I do feel that we need a much more nuanced approach to the different kinds of problems we're talking about. The broad stroke, one size fit all does not work anymore. They are very nuanced, and we need to be aware of those nuances. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Robert, and then David.
Thanks. Yeah, I fully agree with the sentiments of Adele and Salim here that the non-economic damages are perhaps the most important, and they're also more difficult to understand, and more work needs to be done into, well, yeah, understanding what processes are driving these and what the impacts are. But just in terms of economic loss and damages, you know, this problem won't get away, because states will want to know what these costs are, and if they can have better data on the costs, then they're better able to prepare, possibly better able to prevent and deal with these situations. So when we have people displaced, the displaced people are affected, the areas which have suffered from the displacement, but also the communities which are receiving the displaced persons are all affected. And it's important to know what these effects are from an economic point of view, in terms of, therefore, can there be an impact or provision for education, for healthcare, for social services, etc. And the more data that is generated on this, then, as I mentioned earlier, it might be more possible to kind of unlock funds through, who knows, through the UN or else from national budgets or donors to either prevent these displacements, because there is this cost which we feel quite sure that might be suffered, or to then gain some funds to cope with these impacts. That's all. Thanks.
I don't see David anymore. Do you still want to come in? Yeah,
I mentioned this before. I think it's worth underscoring once again the need for empirically calibrated projections of future migration that pair top-down modeling approaches. These are sort of the generalizable rules that we can map onto an entire system, a global system. You know, the RCPs are really good for this. The climate projections and the climate hazards we get out of this, you know, these sort of top-down approaches with a bottom-up simulation, again, of loss and damage, mobility associated with loss and damage. And there's a few examples of this. I've been involved in some of these, but this sort of top-down, bottom-up pairing is very useful for predictions, and we need more of that. And I've written on this and on others as well. And so, you know, those of us who work with highly quantitative models, predictive models, looking forward, I've used gigantic sets of mobile phone data and that are extraordinarily, you know, quantitative, and yet, so speaking to Adele's point, you know, I do field research, and how do you square that up, the sort of millions of migrants moving this way and that way over time, with a woman who lost all of her children in a flooding event, and the extreme trauma that and just despair that she has to live with, and that inform her day-to-day decision making. And I think really we need to keep a grounded perspective on all of this, no matter where we're doing our research, that this really is some of the most painful stuff that humans can deal with. We're talking about human suffering here. And this just needs to be a greater, you know, part of the discussion, I think. And so, yeah, I support that completely.
Thank you. And Sarah?
Thanks. That's quite a hard point to follow, actually, but I wanted to just pull in, I think, onto how quantifications are received and reproduced, as well as the expectations of policy communities and governance processes, because I think that's often a side of these discussions that gets ignored, especially by researchers who were often really focused on the reliability of our results and how grounded they are and how valid they are, and etc., which I think is all, of course, very legitimate. But if we're also looking at policy impacts and being able to contribute to these policy discussions, what happens afterwards with this research is also really important. The first example would be, with these estimations of numbers of people displaced, right, and how they are reproduced in the media, which I think is an ongoing frustration for most people working in this area of work. How can we contribute better to our wonderfully nuanced work with 4 scenarios and ranges of movements not being reduced to one number? And I think being more active in the segue between our research and these media outlets and these policy communities is probably a good place to start with that, so that we're not always asked to comment on these figures. And the second part I would just point on is the expectations of policy communities then. So when they receive these wonderful scenarios that we've developed, what happens with them? And I think it's not that we don't know the full extent of the costs of loss and damage, be the economic or non-economic, that is stopping funding coming for loss and damage, right? It's not knowing what these figures are that's stopping countries coming up with financing. It's probably because certain nation states have an inkling of the huge scale of loss and damage that is why work in this area is too slow. So I think, of course, we need to be developing these better assessments. Of course, we need to be, making our models and everything more accurate and more useful. But at the same time, just emphasizing these quantified things won't always lead to policy action. I think we also need to be doing more work on how these assessments and how these knowledge products are received within policy communities, to look at how we can also turn these wonderful things that we've generated and these new insights into actual policy action out of the other side of it.
Thank you. And that's indeed the other side of the work. And that's why, to some extent, we would like to bring some of your recommendations and insights to the attention of the people working in these policy processes, which is something that, of course, some of you on this panel are already doing much better than we do anyway. But is there any further input on this question on addressing the impacts and quantifying potential impacts on communities? If not, we just have 4 minutes, which makes for an opportunity for a very, very brief last word from each of you, and perhaps a very quick closing. So if you want to just highlight a point that's not been made, or recap something, or really stress something that you've said already, then just raise your hand and take the floor.
Can I go first? So I just want to reiterate and underscore David's point about joining forces. Those of us who deal in quantified data versus those of us who don't, we need to be talking to each other. We need to be understanding each other. And I fully support David's image of thinking who our client is. Our client of everything we do are the poorest people on the planet suffering the impacts of human-induced climate change. We must keep that in the forefront of our mind. We may be working with policymakers, we may be working in very abstract terms in academia, but that is ultimately what I hope we will all keep in our minds, and will give us a grounding and a common a platform to talk to each other and work together going forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Adele.
Yeah, I just like to underscore Sarah's point that no matter how much information we seem to have, it doesn't translate into actual action. I have not been going to the COPs for as long as Salim has, but I am incredibly frustrated by the slow pace of action compared to the urgency of what is needed. And being an IPCC scientist and in the UNFCCC, it's amazing the disparity between what science is telling us and what we're actually doing in the policy space. So we do need to, I think, focus not only on the methodologies and the information and the data, but on how this can actually translate into urgent climate action now. Thanks.
Just a last thought from me. We tend to frame these discussions in very deterministic ways, that a certain amount of climate change will cause a certain number of movement impacts and losses and damages, which will drive a certain number. But I think it's really important to remember always in the case of mobility that all of the most of the key outcomes of interest are a product of our decision making, of our decisions. It's what we choose. This is around emissions, but it's also around adaptation. And then moving forward, there's a set of policy conditions, choices we make that inform, that direct mobility. And so what we want to avoid is a set of decisions that close countries off from each other, that set neighboring countries as in sort of opposition to each other, that armor international boundaries and securitize them, militarize them, because this will ultimately reduce our capacity to adapt to climate change is if we sort of enter in these I would say less than counterproductive policy arrangements. And so just in support of some of Sarah's comments here, the governance issues are going to be key moving forward.
Thank you. Robert?
Yeah, I think I'd just briefly add. So, I mean, I agree that the small person who is affected by loss and damage is the client and the most important person here. And I definitely share the frustrations of how slowly things move through the UNFCCC or other processes. Nonetheless, we have to try and we have to produce these data, and we have to, as has been already stated, combine qualitative and quantitative data. Of course, we have to learn to communicate better, and it's incumbent upon policymakers to absorb and interpret this in a better way also. But yeah, I think we have to keep going, because maybe these things unfortunately take 10 or 15 years to filter through. This seems to be the way that it's worked through the loss and damage process so far. So I know we can't be patient because it's an emergency, but we have to continue and redouble our efforts, I suppose.
All right, Sarah, you still have the opportunity for a last word, but you don't have to if you don't want to.
I feel like Adele and David have wonderfully done that for me in bringing up my point and hammering home that, you know, we need to be looking at the black box of policy and government structures as well, and not just treating it as this like end user from things we create, and that it has to become part of what we're critically, you know, assessing in our work. So I hope to see lots more of us doing that in the future.
Okay, thank you very much for that. This brings us to the end of this conversation. I feel every time privileged that I get to participate actively in this. So thanks a lot to all of you for your contribution. I don't think there is any way to make justice with a 1-minute synthesis to all the discussions that you've had, but there are very nice points that I think we can retain concretely. Then kind of this mobility as a signal, but also as a driver of potential other loss and damages down the line and cascading impacts. The focus on agency, that's key to understanding, you know, what we even qualify a displacement, as well as to reducing the impacts. The different methodological approaches, bottom-up, top-down, that we need to consider and join. The need for systematic data collection on these to strengthen the picture that we need to bring to policymakers, and then the need to follow up with policymakers across different policy areas as well, in order for this to actually be useful and leveraged for the benefit of the people that are at risk or that are affected. So thank you very much. We'll be following up, as I said, with colleagues from the PDD Secretariat with a little bit of a synthesis for this, which we will be circulating. The recording for this will also be online through the same outlets where you find information on this, so the social media profiles of PDD, of IOM, IDMC. And we'll keep you posted also for the next sessions in this series. And hopefully, yeah, we'll have the opportunity to continue this discussion with some of you in the following events in this Triple D series. So thanks a lot very much for taking the time today, and thanks for everyone who was online for attending. And yeah, we'll be in touch on these and on related issues. So, goodbye and have a nice rest of the day.
Thank you very much.